There's a moment avoidants never expect, when the person who loved them, supported them, and patiently waited for emotional closeness finally walks away. It doesn't happen with drama, shouting, or ultimatums. It happens quietly, softly, almost politely, and that's why it hits them harder than anything else ever has. Because avoidants tell themselves a story: if someone leaves, it won't matter. I'm better off alone. I don't need anyone. But then the one person who made them feel safe enough to love actually leaves, and suddenly the story cracks. At first, they pretend nothing is wrong. They convince themselves it's just space, just time, just a break. They distract themselves with work, friends, routine, anything to avoid the emptiness they don't want to name. But late at night, the bravado disappears. The silence becomes loud. Their mind won't stop replaying all the moments they kept distance, shut down, or held their partner at arm's length. They remember every time they avoided saying how they felt, every time vulnerability felt too risky, every time affection felt like a trap. Avoidants spiral because they're finally forced to confront the truth. They didn't lose someone who wanted to control them. They lost someone who wanted to love them. And that realization breaks the inner illusion they've depended on for years. They start questioning themselves. Why didn't I say what I felt? Why did I push them away? Why did I think love was danger instead of comfort? They suddenly see what they couldn't before. That real love wasn't suffocating, it was grounding. It wasn't pressure, it was partnership. The true spiral begins when they try to get the person back. But here's the twist: they don't know how. Avoidants aren't practiced in emotional expression. They aren't skilled in vulnerability. The tools required to repair the relationship are the very tools they avoided using the entire time. And so they panic, they overthink, they craft messages, delete them, rewrite them, and still feel paralyzed. Because what they want most now requires the courage they couldn't find before. And in that moment, when they realize the door is no longer open, they finally understand what love was worth. It's ironic, but losing the real one becomes the only moment that forces an avoidant to confront their own emotional world. It becomes the moment they're pushed into growth, accountability, and introspection. Pain becomes the teacher, loss becomes the mirror, and reflection becomes the turning point. But here's the truth few people speak about. Avoidants don't spiral because they lost someone. They spiral because they finally recognize what they could have had if they had allowed themselves to love bravely instead of safely. And that recognition doesn't fade quickly. It lingers, it echoes, it reshapes them. Sometimes losing the real one doesn't just break an avoidant, it rebuilds them. Because it teaches them the lesson they never wanted but always needed. Love only grows where fear stops leading. Avoidants don't spiral. Simply because someone leaves their life, people come and go all the time. What breaks them open is the sudden clarity that arrives when the noise fades and the silence settles in. For the first time, they are forced to sit alone with the truth they have spent years outrunning. That the person they lost was not just another partner, not just another chapter, but someone who saw them fully and loved them anyway. When that kind of presence disappears, it creates a void. Avoidants are not emotionally prepared to face. They are used to managing relationships from a distance, keeping just enough space to feel safe. But the one who truly cared breaks through those barriers in ways avoidants don't fully grasp until the person is gone. And in the quiet moments after the loss, long after the excuses and distractions have worn thin, they finally feel the weight of what they pushed away. At first, they try to carry on as if nothing has shifted. They lean into routine because predictability feels like control. They tell themselves they didn't need the person anyway, repeating old beliefs that once made them feel strong. I'm better alone. I don't get attached. People always leave. These stories worked before, but this time something is different. The emptiness isn't temporary. The detachment doesn't feel empowering anymore. It feels like a hollow space inside their chest that refuses to be filled. They start replaying memories, small moments, vulnerable moments, moments in which that person offered love, comfort, or understanding that they didn't know how to accept. They remember how that person reached out during their shutdowns, how they stayed patient when they withdrew, how they offered emotional stability that felt foreign but comforting. And suddenly, the avoidant realizes that those gestures weren't ordinary. They were rare, they were intentional, They were signs of someone who genuinely wanted to stay. This dawning awareness overwhelms them because avoidants spend their lives believing people won't care deeply enough to stay. When someone proves that belief wrong and then walks away, not from lack of love, but from lack of reciprocation, the shock is seismic. The silence becomes a mirror reflecting every moment they held back, every chance they missed to express affection, every opportunity for connection they dismissed out of fear. They notice, with a growing ache, how different their emotional world felt when that person was present, calmer, softer, more grounded. And they realized that the presence they took for granted was actually the emotional anchor they didn't know they relied on. Avoidance spiraled because the truth becomes too clear to ignore. They didn't lose someone who demanded too much. They lost someone who asked for the bare minimum. Honesty, affection, vulnerability. They didn't lose someone who suffocated them. They lost someone who gave them space with love instead of distance with coldness. This clarity doesn't just sting. It dismantles the emotional armor they've worn for years. They begin asking themselves hard questions. Why didn't I show up? Why did I stay silent? Why did I protect myself from the very thing I secretly wanted? These questions haunt them because they know the answers point back to their own fear. What intensifies this spiral is the realization that the person they lost wasn't trying to change them. They were trying to love them. And in the absence of that love, avoidance feels something unfamiliar and deeply unsettling: regret. The regret becomes the turning point. It begins to chip at their defenses, forcing them to confront truths they've avoided their entire lives. And it all starts with that one painful moment of clarity, when they finally understand who they lost. The unraveling of an avoidant often begins in the quietest way possible, not through a fight, not through a dramatic exit, but through a slow, subtle realization that the relationship didn't end because of chaos. It ended because of emotional absence. That kind of ending is far more confronting for an avoidant than any argument could ever be. Arguments give them a reason to detach. Drama gives them a justification to run. But silence? That leaves them face to face with themselves when the person they cared about walks away calmly, without anger, without begging, without emotional explosions. The avoidant is left wondering how something so seemingly peaceful can hurt so much. And that's when the truth hits. The quiet departure wasn't a sign of indifference. It was a sign of exhaustion. Emotional exhaustion caused by the avoidant's inability to show up. They begin to replay moments in their mind, not out of nostalgia, but out of confusion. How did it get to this point? They remember days when their partner tried to express their needs gently, only to be met with walls. They remember conversations that drifted into nothingness because the avoidant shut down instead of opening up. They remember being physically present but emotionally distant, offering responses without connection, attention without intimacy, presence without engagement. At the time, it felt like they were maintaining safety, but now, in hindsight, they see it for what it was: slow, unintentional neglect. What makes this realization so painful is that avoidants are not unaware of their partner's efforts. They remember every moment of care, every attempt at closeness, every soft invitation to open up. They simply didn't know how to respond. They told themselves they had time, that their partner would always be there, that love could survive distance if it was meant to be. But love doesn't fade because of fate. It fades because of repeated emotional absence. And when their partner finally stopped trying, the avoidant misinterpreted it at first as peace. Only later did they understand that what looked like peace was actually resignation. The internal shift happens slowly. They begin to realize that the person they lost didn't leave because of incompatibility. They left because they felt alone in a relationship that was supposed to be a partnership. And that realization is devastating. It forces the avoidant to see their patterns not as harmless self-protection, but as behaviors that slowly eroded someone's emotional safety. They begin to understand that their partner didn't want perfection. They wanted participation. They didn't want constant vulnerability. They just wanted presence, reassurance, a sign that their feelings mattered. And the avoidant now sees how often they failed to offer even those small forms of connection. The spiral deepens when they grasp that the ending wasn't abrupt at all. It was the final chapter of a long and quiet emotional story. Their partner didn't leave suddenly. They left gradually, withdrawing in the same way the avoidant once did. But while the avoidance withdrawal was a defense mechanism, their partner's withdrawal was self-preservation. The avoidant now sees the symmetry and feels the sting of it. They pushed away the very person who was trying hardest to stay close, and when they finally accept that the breakup wasn't caused by conflict, but by their own emotional distance, regret forms in a way they've never felt before. They see how avoidant tendencies, which once felt protective, became the silent force that ended something real. And it's in that moment, when they understand the relationship died from apathy and absence rather than anger, that the true spiral begins. Avoidants live with an internal contradiction. They rarely acknowledge, and when they lose someone who genuinely mattered, that contradiction becomes impossible to ignore. They have always wanted connection, deep, meaningful connection, yet every time it approaches, they feel an instinctive pull to retreat. It's not because they don't care, it's because caring feels dangerous. Vulnerability feels like stepping into a spotlight without armor. Intimacy feels like giving someone a map to the places they've spent their whole lives hiding. So they dance on the edges of closeness, stepping forward just enough to feel wanted, then stepping back the moment they sense emotional intensity. This push and pull pattern doesn't seem destructive to them at the time. It feels necessary. It feels safe. But when they lose the person who saw past their walls, everything they thought protected them suddenly turns into the very thing that kept them from what they truly desired. After the loss, avoidants begin to see the emotional split inside themselves with painful clarity. They remember the moments when their partner reached out, moments when they felt warmth, connection, comfort. Part of them longed to lean into those moments, to accept the closeness, to trust it. But the other part grew tense, afraid of depending on someone, afraid of needing someone, afraid of being seen. That internal tension became a silent battlefield, one they never explained, one their partner could feel even if the avoidant said nothing. In the aftermath, avoidants can't stop replaying those scenes. They now understand that their silence was not neutral, it was a message. Their withdrawal wasn't invisible, it was felt deeply. And their fear didn't protect them. It created distance that eventually became too wide to cross. The spiral begins as they realize that the relationship didn't fail because love was lacking. It failed because fear outweighed expression. They wanted to offer more affection, more reassurance, more openness, but fear always arrived 1 second faster than courage. They avoided conversations that mattered. They avoided moments where vulnerability was required. They avoided expressing their true feelings until expressing them no longer mattered because the other person had already gone numb. And now, in the quiet, they feel the weight of every unspoken sentence, every withheld "I care," every restrained moment of affection. These memories don't fade easily, they echo. Avoidants then face another harsh truth. Their partner wasn't asking for intensity, they were asking for honesty. They weren't asking for constant emotional availability. They were asking for clarity, presence, consistency, things the avoidant believed they were giving simply because they stayed. But staying physically doesn't mean staying emotionally. And when avoidants confront how often they chose comfort over connection, the regret becomes suffocating. What hurts most is that avoidants now see the relationship through a sharper lens. They realized they weren't the only ones who struggled with fear. Their partner struggled too, but had the courage to keep trying. While the avoidant hid behind self-protection, their partner was offering warmth, reassurance, patience. That contrast becomes painful. They see how their partner kept meeting them where they were, hoping one day they'd feel safe enough to meet back. And they now understand how lonely that must have been. The internal battle. Wanting closeness yet fearing it becomes their biggest source of grief. Because losing someone who truly cared forces them to confront the simple truth they've spent years avoiding. Love requires presence, not perfection. It requires effort, not expertise. And in pushing away the person who tried hardest to stay, they finally see how deeply they wanted what they spent so long running from. The moment an avoidant realizes they want the person back is the moment their spiral deepens. Wanting someone requires vulnerability, and vulnerability is the very thing they've spent their whole lives avoiding. They are suddenly confronted with the emotional toolkit they never built, skills most people develop through practice, mistakes, and repair. But avoidants have spent years shielding themselves from the discomfort of emotional openness, which means when they finally need those skills, they find themselves empty-handed. They don't know how to express longing without feeling exposed. They don't know how to apologize without feeling ashamed. They don't know how to initiate emotional conversations without feeling like they're stepping into danger. So they freeze. The desire to reach out crashes into the fear of being seen. And that internal collision leaves them stuck in a loop that feels impossible to break. They begin to draft messages, long, emotional, honest messages. But the moment they read them back, panic sets in. The words feel too revealing, too raw, too unlike the persona they've maintained. They delete them, rewrite them, soften them, then delete them again. Every attempt to communicate becomes a battle between their desire to reconnect and the instinct to protect themselves. They worry about being rejected, about being misunderstood, about seeming needy or desperate. The irony is that these fears loom largest precisely when they need connection the most. And that's what makes the spiral so painful. They want to bridge the gap, but every step toward vulnerability feels like stepping off a cliff. The avoidant then begins to analyze the situation from every angle, overthinking every possible reaction. They imagine what they would say, how the other person might respond, how the conversation could unfold. These imagined scenarios become overwhelming because avoidants tend to catastrophize vulnerability. They assume the worst outcome is the most likely one. They fear that reaching out will confirm their deepest insecurity, that the person they lost no longer wants them. And because this fear is unbearable, they often retreat again, telling themselves they need more time, more clarity, more courage. But time doesn't help. It only gives more room for fear to grow. What intensifies their distress is the awareness that simply wanting the relationship back isn't enough. They know that if they do get the chance to try again, it won't be fixed with charm or logic or surface-level apologies. It requires emotional presence, consistent reassurance, real vulnerability, the very things they avoided before. This realization feels like standing at the edge of a door they don't know how to open. The handle is right there, but their hands won't move. They feel the weight of everything they didn't say, everything they didn't give, everything they withheld. And for the first time, they understand that repairing the relationship demands a version of themselves they've never practiced being. Every part of the process feels foreign. Apologizing feels like admitting weakness. Expressing care feels exposing. Asking for another chance feels humiliating. But underneath all of that is a deeper truth. Avoidants don't lack emotion. They lack the confidence to express it. And so when they try to get the person back, the emotional tools they need, communication, vulnerability, honesty, feel shaky and unfamiliar. This gap between intention and ability becomes the core of their spiral. They want to be brave, but bravery feels like a language they never learned. And as they confront their own limitations, the pain of wanting someone they pushed away becomes heavier than anything they've carried before. Losing someone who truly mattered does something to an avoidant that nothing else ever has. It forces them into a level of self-reflection they've spent their entire lives avoiding. Pain becomes the one thing strong enough to break through their emotional armor. In the beginning, they try to resist it. They try to distract themselves, bury themselves in work, rationalize the loss, or convince themselves they're fine. But heartbreak has a strange way of slipping through the cracks of even the thickest defenses. It shows up at unexpected moments, during a quiet morning, a familiar song, an empty room, and each time it surfaces, it pushes them closer to truths they've never dared to confront. They start replaying the relationship with a clarity they didn't have before. Not the surface-level memories, but the emotional ones. The moments where they shut down even though they wanted to stay open. the nights their partner reached out and they responded with distance instead of warmth, the opportunities for closeness they dodged because their fear convinced them that vulnerability was danger. And for the first time, they see their patterns not as harmless habits, but as actions with consequences. Consequences that led directly to losing someone who genuinely cared. This realization isn't quick. It builds slowly, like a weight pressing against their chest. They begin to understand that love isn't just about showing up physically, it's about showing up emotionally. And their inability to do that didn't protect them. It cost them something irreplaceable. As they sit with this truth, the regret becomes a mirror. They see the version of themselves they were in the relationship, guarded, distant, self-contained, but they also see the version they could have been if fear hadn't been their guide. The gap between those two versions becomes painful to acknowledge. What transforms them is not just the loss itself, but the understanding that the person they lost wasn't asking for perfection. They weren't asking for dramatic declarations or over-the-top efforts. They simply wanted transparency, connection, presence. And the avoidant now recognizes how many chances they had to offer those things, moments they let slip away because they were too focused on protecting themselves from potential hurt. Ironically, in trying to avoid the pain of vulnerability, they created a greater pain through avoidance. This awareness starts to shift something inside them. They begin to question the beliefs they've held for years, that closeness is dangerous, that independence means isolation, that needing someone is weakness. The loss challenges these beliefs so deeply that they can no longer hold on to them the same way. They start noticing how heavy their defenses have become, how much energy it takes to stay guarded, how much loneliness comes from avoiding intimacy. It becomes clear that their old way of relating didn't keep them safe, it kept them disconnected. Slowly, almost reluctantly, they begin to soften. They begin to imagine what it would look like to show up differently in the future, not just to win someone back, but to avoid losing themselves to fear again. They start to consider vulnerability not as exposure, but as connection. They start to see that expressing emotion doesn't lead to abandonment. Withholding emotion does. The breakup becomes a catalyst, pushing them toward emotional accountability they never embraced before. Pain forces them to grow in a way comfort never could. Losing the real one cracks them open, not just with regret, but with the realization that change is possible. And while it hurts deeply, it also marks the beginning of a transformation. The moment they finally understand that love can only flourish when fear stops being the one in control. And so, as we reflect on what happens when an avoidant loses the real one, we're reminded that love is not lost in sudden explosions, but in quiet hesitations, withheld emotions, and the fears we allow to lead us. Yet within that loss lies the greatest opportunity for growth. Because the moment we confront our patterns is the moment we reclaim our power to love differently. May we all choose connection over fear, honesty over silence, and courage over comfort, so we never realize too late what was once in our hands. Thank you for your time, your presence, and your willingness to look inward, because awareness is the first step toward transformation.